Power and what it means in the workplace is an interesting topic. It immediately brings up thoughts of abuses, things like bullying, domineering, obstructing, controlling, but can also relate to positive influences like championing great ideas and providing new opportunities. It's all in how we look and use our influence as leaders. And as leaders, we go through this at various points in our careers, having varying degrees of power in that employee journey. And it's vital to understand the dark side and light side, yeah, I'm getting very Jedi on here, of that part of our journey. Our guest today will help with that. Hold on. Welcome to Relationships at Work, the leadership guide to creating a workplace we love. I'm Russel, a communications and leadership nerd with a couple of decades of experience and a double dose of curiosity on how we can make the workplace better. This show, it's a great place to start. I was out with a friend of mine recently to catch up on all things work, and we had a great conversation about defining leadership, which, you know, if you listen to the show, I'm a huge proponent of, and the impact that leadership can have on employees. Now, what really sank in for me is the fact that I'm basically going to school every week as a host of this show. New perspectives, reinforcing values and beliefs, and mindsets, and tactics. I just want to thank you for joining this workplace culture and employee experience classroom with me. You didn't have to bring an apple, but I still really appreciate you being here because it really helps the show grow. It's been amazing. And if you think anyone else you know would benefit from joining Relationships at Work University, see what I did there? Pass along the show to them. Email, social media, through a conversation, and we can help them improve leadership and the place we all go to most of the time, work. Now, the topic today, as it pertains to work, got me really, really excited when Dr. Stephen Barden proposed it about talking about power in the workplace. And I couldn't have been more, yes, let's talk about influence. Let's talk about power. Absolutely, please, very much, yes. Leadership is always such a focus, but I can't believe how much influence isn't. We talk about influencers as it comes to like social media and unboxing things, but I mean influence within an organization that impacts the culture and employees. It's like this thing we know exists, people have it, but we don't want to talk about power. Maybe some of the positive aspects about it, because then we have to admit that there is bad aspects. And quietly, we know there's a lot of bad, because the term power just immediately feels like a bad thing. It feels hierarchical. It feels overbearing. Like power over is what comes to mind. And we've all worked for leaders that abuse that power. Those that are able to act inappropriately at work because of their position in the company. I knew someone who yelled at people in sort of this common space area in the office. They were yelling all the time to a particular employee about their work performance because, truthfully, that leader, I use air quotes, could get away with it because they were in a position of power. They were at the top of the food chain. My guest today shares stories just like that, but also the importance of power and influence in making the workplace better. It's just about finding the right balance in power and responsibility and what we do with that and how we do it consistently. Hell, he's got a doctorate based on his research into how top organizational leaders learn to use power and authority. So let's go talk to Dr. Barden. And on the show today, we have Dr. Stephen Barden, and here is why he is awesome. He's a board advisor, strategic advisor, and leadership coach mentor through his consultancy, Stephen Barden Coaching Limited. It's a good thing he's in charge of that because it's got his name on the door. He's been a member of the C-suite as an CEO and COO in various media organizations for decades before that. His doctorate was awarded on his research into how top organizational leaders can learn to use power and authority. Pretty handy for the conversation we're about to have. And he's the author of the book, How Successful Leaders Do Business with Their World, The Navigational Stance. And hey, he's a podcaster too. He's the host of The Power of Balance. Hello to you, Stephen. I almost was able to do that in one breath.
You did. In fact, you did do it in one breath. Hi, Russell. Good to be here, and thank you.
So we have to kick off the show like we always kick off the show, Stephen, which is asking the question, what's your best or worst employee experience, sir?
Or worst.
Or
worst. Well, funnily enough, my worst one probably was I was a 20-year-old kid, and I went into I was appointed to what was then my dream job, which was what was called an announcer producer on radio in South Africa, where I lived in those days. And my direct boss, who died some years later, but my direct boss used to hit on me quite a lot. I mean, literally, and when I sort of refused to put out, then tried to block me in a number of ways. So I couldn't get the stuff that I knew I needed to do. Like I wanted to direct plays, I was blocked, etc., etc. So that was the bad part. The good part of that is I learned my own power. In I could say no, and I learned it more that I could actually go around him. So there was somebody, trying to abuse, and in many ways abusing, but I learned to go around. I learned to go around him. I learned to be water rather than a battering ram.
A little Bruce Lee semi-quote there. I like that. Just flow like water around instead of...
Yeah, go through the holes in the wall. Yeah.
How did you realize you had power to be able to make that choice or make that the move around?
I think, without going too deeply on it, I think that what drove me was my own love for the job. I really wanted to make documentaries and direct plays, and I really loved that job. And I mean, it was a time I used to literally run to work at 7 a.m. and you had to be dragged away. So it was that love, that was a real passion on it, on the one hand. And also, I suppose, if I follow the thesis of my book, it's something that you learn as a kid while you're exploring your own space. As a kid, what you learn to assume that, I can do certain things. Because power is what you assume you have as well as, what you actually have. So I think that part of it was what I learned as a kid, and part of it was really driven by this huge passion to do a good job, to do that job. Nobody was going to stop me, put it this way. That was what I was going through.
Yeah, and it's hard for a lot of people because they don't have that confidence, or they feel the term of the career limiting move, as it would, if they do anything that sort of rocks the boat or changes the status quo or does truth to power. People immediately get that fear that it's going to have repercussions if they don't.
Yeah.
So let's dive into the term of power. Because I'm thinking of a lot of TV shows, Succession and so forth, around the idea of what power looks like, because it has such negative connotations generally to it nowadays. Maybe it didn't always. So what is your definition of power as it pertains to the workplace?
Well, power for me is, I stripped it down. What I did when I, because that's exactly what I did in the book, by the way, is just stripped it down and said, so what actually is power? And if you strip it down to its basic, Russell, it's the ability to be able to act in a context, right? So that's the thing. The more scope you have to do that, the more power we're said to have, right? But power, sustainable power, is always in relationship. I don't think anybody can talk about having absolute power. Even if you've been marooned or shipwrecked on an island, you don't have absolute power. If you think you have absolute power, remember that the scorpion. Tell that to the scorpion who bites you as you're dying. And even I was listening to a great podcast on slavery this morning, and those people who were transatlantic slaves who were taken from Africa and were hugely traumatized and hugely, and the survival rate was so low, yet they could stand up, and they did stand up frequently in uprisings, in rebellions. So even there, there is no absolute power that can be done. So power is a couple of things. Power is always in relationship, and I think when they're thinking about the power that their bosses have over them, just let them remember that their power is always in relationship with ours. That you could only do in relation to what other doers and doings are doing. I think I've got 3 doings in there, but never mind. Power with fear is particularly in a knowledge-based economy. Now you can argue that it can be effective in a drilled economy, but in a knowledge-based economy, it's just bad for business, Russell. It reduces the power to think. It reduces the power to take initiatives and risks. It does all that. So power with fear, if somebody's trying to make sure that you do things through fear, know that they are actually being extremely bad leaders, and they're bad for the organization, let alone for you.
Well, you're very specific in the term power, and I'm curious why you didn't. How is it different than words like authority or influence, where others would probably think that's what we're talking about?
Okay. Power includes influence. Power doesn't have to include authority. Because I can have power, or you can have power, we can have power in the ability to do things. Say we're running a company together, we can have, and as partners, we can have power to the ability to do things with each other for that company without necessarily having authority, right? I can also have power if if I'm a leader of one myself in an organization, if I can help to influence, if I can influence the organization to get towards its goals. Authority is the office. It's the office that I've been given, and the office is vested with an assumption of power, if you like. That's authority. So if I'm the chief executive, even if I'm a complete nothing, if you like, or whatever, I have the authority. I'm given the authority. So that authority imbues me with an assumed ability to do things. Right? Prime ministership, apparently, not so much more in this country, but prime ministership.
I'm sorry, this interview's been 5 minutes long. You must have a new PM by now.
What do you mean, a new PM? There's probably 3 waiting in the corridors. What are we talking about?
You've touched on their different types of power, though. We've got relationship power. We've got a positional power. Are there any other types?
Well, I'm saying that all power is relational,
right.
Number one. Whatever happens. And it's all to do with the ability to act. It's all to do with the ability to act. Now, you use your power in different ways. We've imbued power and leadership with a myth, and the myth is that leaders lead from the front, quote unquote. That leaders have to be there on the white horse. And it's nonsense in the sense that you cannot have in a modern organization all power, all leadership centered around one person. Because even if you're just leading a team of 4 and you're saying, I'm the leader, I'll decide, you bring all your troubles to me. I don't even have to be autocratic, but, give it all to me and I'll take it all on. You don't have to, I won't ask you for help. I'll do it all by myself. You're reducing that team to the size of your head. And we've both seen CEOs of massive corporations reducing their corporations to the size of their heads. People, CEOs have written great, lovely books telling us about their success, but of course, it only lasts. That corporation only lasts while they're there. So, those myths of leading from the front, of all centering around the leader, is a myth that probably in reality died somewhere in a crusade, in an unsuccessful crusade in the 12th century. But so that's where I differ in terms of, I'm saying, let's demystify the terms. Power is what you're able to do, and the more you're able to do, the more you're able to persuade, the more you're able to act on behalf of your organization, the more power you have.
It reminds me of a story I heard out of, I think it was Australia, where the PM out of there only hired people that were very much on the yes, I'll do whatever you want. Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah.
Not thinking anything more than they were doers. They were there to be influenced by the power at the top to go do a thing. Well, in politics, the leader at the top tends to change every couple of years. So when the new person came in and was trying to lead, they're surrounded by a theme of yes, yes, yes people, not innovators. And then that new PM was like, you people aren't original thinkers. You people aren't innovators, because they weren't hired to be. So that power at the beginning was very power, but it wasn't leadership, because it couldn't survive past the power of the previous role. So I find that really interesting, of seeing that difference between leadership and power.
Interesting, while you were saying that, of course, they gave power to their previous prime minister, because they basically said, what do I need to be able to stay here? I need to be able to say yes to this man. So they gave power. Probably in return, they think they were getting some sort of power, but they gave power away. They gave it completely away, didn't they? Do you think?
Well, they were hired to, right? They were
yes, precisely. That's exactly right.
That particular person wasn't looking for innovative people. He was looking for, I know everything. I'm the innovator. Go do the thing that I want you to go do. I'm looking for yes men, for a lack of a better term. Yes men and women. So of course they fit the model of the culture in which they were building, not for longevity, but for, in that case, political will.
Yeah. And I think that's absolutely right. I was thinking as well that, my first story that I told you about being in South Africa, I used to work for this organization called the South African Broadcasting Corporation, which I left sort of after 5 years. But it was basically the instrument when it came to the news, not in anything else, but when it came to the news and stuff, like, it was the instrument of the apartheid government. So when the apartheid government fell, there was a great deal of nervousness that this SABC, this propaganda instrument, would resist the new ANC movement, the new government of Mandela. Guess what it did? It became the perfect instrument of the new government, because that's what they were hired to do. Yeah.
That leads me to my next question, which is really about that relationship with power. As someone enters into an organization, as they move up in an organization, the relationship people have with power, how do you feel it changes?
It all depends on what you assume, what you've learned to assume, and continue to learn to assume about the use of power. I think if your focus is on taking if your assumption when you came out of your childhood was that power, I am in conflict with my world, so my power, that I'm going to use my power to defend myself against the world, and that's another conversation. I think basically the assumption, what I call the navigational stance, is that children emerge with this foundational assumption that either the world, they are in a imbalance with the world. In other words, the world is not a friendly place, and it will try and stop them. So they need to actually defend themselves against the world, or, as in some cases, people in power who we both know right now, they feel they are so superior to the world that the world is simply there as their chattel. And the best leaders, I'm saying, the finest leaders, are the ones who have a power balance. They have an assumption of a power balance. The world and I are in a reasonably balanced power, and we can do business with it, and hence the title of the book. We can do business. We'll deal with it. We don't get the world when we fall and stub our toes. Not because the world is against us, it's because we fell and stub our toes. If we get fired, it's not because the world is. So that's basically it. So it depends how you feel as you get more and more power. Now, I have seen, as we all seen, people who get more and more power who get more and more dictatorial because they get more and more defensive, and therefore they're taking some sort of vengeance on the world, if you like. That's the simplicity. But then you get others who are really much more balanced, who, as they get more power, think, how can I do more for this organization? How can I take this organization forward? And those are the people that, those are the people that I try to, and I think, judging from your work as well, that's something that's key to you. I try to get leaders to think more and more about what is success in leadership. If you are somebody who is constantly trying to prove their power or disprove their lack of power, you're going to work for your interests all the time. It doesn't matter. You won't care what the organization is doing. However, if you do care about the organization, you are always going to try and think of things like, how do I take this entire organization forward, or this entire team forward? How do I make sure that there is a reasonable balance of interests of the stakeholders? Because I understand, if I am somebody with a reasonable balance of power with the world, I understand that if I neglect to look after the interests of some members of my team, it's going to make life difficult for me next time, number one. Number two, we're not all going to learn. We're not all going to learn. And what do we learn to do? We need to learn to do things better next time. Whether it is better for the overall company or better for the overall team, we need to learn to do things better next time. We learn and if I am one of the stakeholders who's been neglected, I'm going to be reluctant to use my learning for the benefit of the team. So we need to take them all forward. And I think we talked about that. My research found that the people who were the most successful as leaders, and really at the top level, because my research was done for the book and for the thesis, and the book was run at the very top level. So we're talking about 3- and 4-star generals. We're talking about really global leaders and things like that. They worked in this partnering way. They partnered with their stakeholders. So they would reach out and ask for people. They would surrounded themselves with immensely intelligent people. And they always tapped in, even when they were really right at the top of the tree. They used to do what one of them said, I always listened to the buzzing in the woodwork. They would always find out what was the mood, what was the morale, what was going on in the organization. They were really good at that. And they would, one guy said to me, what I do is I touch, he says, I touch and I taste what's going on in the organization all the time. And he was really dipping in and finding out what was going on all the time. So there's this extremely alert attitude as people sort of went up further and further into power to what was going on in the organization. The organization for them was an ecosystem in which they had to make sure that everyone's interests were at least highly alert to that. There were times when they would clearly have to. I mean, one of the generals said to me that at one stage he knew that as they were sort of advancing, the operations at the back, the logistics at the back were getting log jammed. But he knew he had enough supplies, enough of weaponry and food and whatever. So it didn't matter whether it was jammed up. So he had to, for the sake of speed, he had to ignore what was going on back in the supply lines. So sometimes you have to ignore it. Sometimes you even have to ignore, tiredness and morale in people because you have to drive it through. But you are aware of it and you make up for it next time.
I'm glad you brought up navigational stance because that obviously is paramount to the book. And the part that I like, and to briefly summarize it on a very highest of levels, how leaders experience their learning, their assumptions, and how it impacts their ideas around power. What's learning's role in this? You touched on it a little bit in there. And as you work through an organization, what is the learning relationship? What is the relationship to learning when it comes to people's relationship with power?
I listened to your podcast. I think it's your latest one about continuous development, continuous learning. And for me, that is a must. I mean, and learning it's this curiosity, and I think all leaders need to have this curiosity, and it's the curiosity of, how can I do this better? How can I do this better? Where do I need to learn to do this better? So it's always for me context and text. So when people say, I can't learn, I can't read, I can't do this stuff because I'm too busy doing my job. I've just arrived in this job. Well, actually, you can and you must, because when you're doing the job, you're doing a very narrow part of it. You don't know. You've got to know what it is to do the job better tomorrow. You've got to know what it is about this organization that is different from other organizations, because you may come in as a specialist from company A, which is a completely different culture from company B. So you have to learn. So it's not just learning about the actual job. It's learning about the context of the job. It's learning about the relationships of the job. It's learning about what's going on in the world, about, in terms of similar sort of jobs. So you keep on going. For me, learning, and particularly the appetite, that learning has to continue on that. It's almost relentless. It's not all-consuming. You've also got to learn, by the way, that if I carry on being obsessed about the job, I'm also not going to do it very well. So I've got to learn something about myself all the time. So I've got to learn that I need some sleep, I need some rest, I need to get away from this desk or away from this focus in order to think innovatively. So this learning, and the more appetite you have for the learning, the more successful you become and the higher you get. If that is too much, I'm not sure how much it's going to work. I had a chief executive the other day who said to me that she never reads. Never reads. I said, well, what do you mean you never read? I haven't got time to read. And I can understand part of it, because when you're under pressure, there is a panic. God, I'm reading. Why am I taking this time to read? When actually that poor little soul is saying, poor little souls of all kinds are saying, I don't have time for this. This is an indulgence. You have to make sure that you're doing a job in a variety of contexts, and you better know more and more and more about those contexts as you're going along. Does that make sense at all?
It does, but it also brings up the notion of power. So there's a lot of executives that, from the outside looking in, look like they have tons of power, but they're also the ones that have no control over their calendar, are in millions of meetings every day, because they don't have that time that you're talking about to even read, much less lead, because they're in these meetings. So do they really have a lot of power? Because really they're just going with what's expected of them rather than leading, because the clock tells them they got to be at the next meeting. Oh, they got 13 seconds. They better go to the next Zoom call or whatever. So that relationship to power and time seems really relevant.
Yeah, and it's power and fear. It's fear. And the number of people I found who lead, they're rather than the leaders, they're drivers. So they drive themselves and they drive their organization. They just drive through. And of course, it is this fear that if I don't drive, it'll all stop. I will fail. The organization will fail. So they don't stop to think, let's take a look. What is my strategy? How am I going to make sure that those strategic goals are fulfilled? What do I need to do? So a thoughtful way of doing things. Leadership does need to be thoughtful. The people you're describing are people, in my view, who are driven by fear and therefore drive their organizations and themselves, and they'd have no time because there is fear biting at them all the time. I remember a global actually executive divisional executive in a very large company who specialized his subtle speciality of leading was roaring and screaming at people. I mean, really, to the point of and down a phone, face to face, whatever, scream, shout, you do this, and the abuse. The fear, as I got to know about this person more and more and more, I realized how terrified this person was. He was terrified. They'd had a traumatic sort of experience of failure, what they thought was a traumatic experience of failure some years ago. And it just drove him completely. It was fear, total fear. And of course, by his fear then he was instilling his fear into others, and the organization just was shrinking and shrinking and shrinking and shrinking in its ability to be innovative. So yeah, that, and people who don't read, and people who are bounced off the walls, who have an assistant or whatever who's saying, you've got to go from one meeting to another. The most difficult thing I find when I coach chief executives is saying to them a couple of things. Don't go from one meeting into another, for heaven's sake. You're a commodity if you do that. Don't. So to get them to take a 10, 15-minute break so they can prepare for the next meeting, incredibly difficult. That's incredibly difficult. The other thing is to get them to sit down and think about their organizations. There are some who are brilliant at it, but the type of person that you're talking about, that driving person, very rarely do they think about the organization. They jump in and they use words like gut instinct and things like that, which, if I run a company on my digestive system, I have a problem.
Now, navigational stance is key to your work and your research, and springing from that is the navigational compass. Can you explain that a little bit? Because I do really enjoy the idea of these tendencies when it comes to power.
The navigational compass, the stance, I think we've covered to a certain extent. The compass was that after I'd finished all this research, I found that as I was doing the research, there were some themes that came through, and they had these, I think it was 10 tendencies that they all had in common. Now they weren't 10 traits or habits or anything like that. They were 10 assumptions in many ways. There were a few things that worked there. One of them was this thing called navigation. That's what it was called, the navigation. So these guys would look at a target and they'd say, right, how do I get there? And they would be able to do two things. They certainly would steer towards the target, but they would also make sure that if the route, the planned route they were going on, if that wasn't available anymore or it was creating obstacles, they were quite prepared to tack at 90 degrees. So they worked almost like yachtsmen, when you tack at 90 degrees completely. And everybody thinks you're going the wrong way, but actually they would tack at 90 degrees. They weren't fanatics for hitting targets. This thing about you've got to hit that target. No. They knew that as long as their company went into a particular direction, moved towards its progress, that was more important to them than anything else. All of them, some of them with resentment, but all of them really made sure that they had what I called a triangular critique. So they would challenge themselves, they would challenge others, and they would structure into their organizations challenge from others. And they would go and seek out challenges because they knew it would be fatal if they went into their bubble, into their inner circle. A lot of them succumbed to this inner circle later on because it's just really tiring to go looking for challenges. So, and by challenges, they would have forums in which they'd say, Tell me what's wrong. Tell me what we're doing wrong here. Tell me if this works. Tell me, keep on. And they would reward people for doing that well. Because we both know that, it's all very, very well leaders saying, my door's always open. And, you could always come and talk to me, and you can always tell me if I'm doing something wrong. The chances that you're going to tell your boss, you know what, I was thinking about it, you're doing a crap job, it's not going to work. So this one, they incentivized. And, I think people like, Ray Dalio at Bridgewater did that very well, where it was, you would never attack the person, you never criticize the person, you criticize the idea. You brought forward ideas, and they were tested for robustness. They were tested for their robustness, and at the end of the day, the thought was that if we all test the robustness of your idea, by the time we leave this room, it will be much more robust than when it came in. They all had mentors at some stage. Now, they didn't have mentors that they hung on to. And it wasn't a really sort of sentimental, it wasn't even a sentimental relationship, but it was the mentor as a disruptor. So throughout their lives, you could point out to having people who would disrupt their lives in some way. They would, as one of the leaders said to me, I had one who used to kick me up the arse a lot, to literally to disrupt. Stop thinking like that. Move on in a different way. They were all, and I think that we touched on this, they all saw their organizations as an ecosystem holistically. So they saw the linkages. So they were very aware of text and context. They knew that if they outsourced their, the manufacture of their shoes or whatever it was to Vietnam, they've got to keep an eye on what's going on in Vietnam, because never mind what happens, if something goes up in that factory, even if it's outsourced, even if it's somebody else's responsibility, they're going to get the blame. So they were always aware of the linkages. They knew what affected everything else. So there were these 10 compass points that governed the way they thought. And it all came down at the end that they always looked. They very rarely isolated themselves. They would, for example, they called it, socializing the file, where one talked about the ability to be able to, before you do anything, before you decide on anything, or before you enact it, take it to people and say, what do you think? Tell me about this. And there's a couple of reasons. Maybe it tests the decision, but more important, even if you're determined to put it forward, by socializing the file beforehand, you're making sure that those people who are going to execute your decision understand what you're doing. Even if they disagree with you, they will understand what you're doing, so the chances that they will execute it more effectively are much greater than that. And they all had this stuff that ended up, if you like, encapsulated in what I call the partnering stance. They will work in partnership with the world all the time. All the time.
Say someone is growing in their organization. They're getting to that point where they're just getting that influence in their organization, their power, for better sake, but they don't know what to do. What would be your first recommendation of better understand your organization, better understand the ecosystem? Like that jumps out at me huge as a way of really embracing that power and understanding that power. What else would you recommend for those people?
I'd also recommend go and find somebody who knows the organization very well and say to them, tell me something about what would happen? What does this organization need? What is it that would add value to this organization? What can I do that other people can't do? So find somebody who can act as a mentor to you in terms of that. But there's certainly, particularly if you've just gone into the organization, make sure, when they talk about integration programs, and I think you talked about as one of your guests earlier on, when they talk about those first integration programs. I used to do quite a lot of those when I was as part of my coaching practice. What I would say is, don't just get to know what your job is. and your job description. Go and find out what is expected of you, unspoken. Because you may there as be head of technology, what do they really want? And that will tell you part of what the organization needs, and it'll give you your direction. Go and find out. Don't just find out who's in the hierarchy. Go and find out who are the influencers in the organization. Go and find out from them what this organization needs and what is acceptable. Because I remember once when taking over an organization as a CEO, and I went in full of wind and macho, thinking, well, I've got to cut down this. This is too flabby, etc. The old thing. And I was about to make one person redundant, and a woman I remember sidled up to me and she said, "Stephen, don't do that. Don't do that." I said, "Why not? Don't be soft. Why not?" She said, "Don't do that. He is your memory officer. He knows what's what in this organization. He knows exactly where all the bodies are buried, etc. You need to keep him so that you can learn." The people we're talking about need to go and find out people like that. Go and find out all the hidden stuff, if you like, or the unspoken stuff that you need to know. And that'll give you direction of what the organization needs, and therefore what you need to be able to do to exercise that power.
My favorite question to ask when anybody's asking me, what should I do? How should I do it? I always ask the question, what does success look like? What does success look like? Because, and you've made me twist it a bit here, because when I think what does success look like, I'm thinking, what does success look like to that leader, to that person? But really, what does success look like to the organization? What does success look like to the ecosystem? Because what you think success is might be very different than what your boss thinks success is. If you're hired to do a job and you want to show your power and influence, it has to fit within the model of the organization, not just what you're barreling in and going off to do.
Yeah. Success, it's again, when I was doing the book, I had to find out and define what success was, right? So success, in order to be successful as a leader, you need to be able to take the entire constituency. So objectively, let's take a look at it. Success for an organization is when that organization is brought closer to its strategic goals, right? And its purpose, because there's a meta goal as well. It needs to be taken closer to that, number one. It needs to be able to learn from each wave, right? So it needs to be able to sustain itself going forward. And success needs to be where the organization's stakeholders are, again, as I think said before, their interests are reasonably balanced and looked after. Because an organization where it only looks after its shareholders and may be massively successful is not a successful organization. And I do believe that history in a way shows that. It may be very good for the shareholder, but it's not going to be long-lived. It's going to go at some stage. So I don't believe that's an organization that doesn't learn to do things better next time. By definition, is not going to be a successful organization. And an organization that does not take into account its stakeholders in a balanced way. Be those stakeholders, by the way, suppliers, purchasers, customers, whatever. You've got to give some sort of balance to them, because if you don't, your suppliers will go somewhere else. Your suppliers will up your costs when you least need. So you've got to keep them going. So it's those three things. It's getting it closer to your goals. It's making sure that you are moving the whole learning, that the organization learns how to do it better, and it's making sure that you are reasonably balanced all the interests of the stakeholders. That's success.
We're talking a lot about our power, like a person's power.
Yeah.
How is a leader who has already maybe figured out their level of power, their level of influence, how can they help others figure out their power, find their success in an organization?
Good question. I think the best way that leader can do is to ensure that their mentee, their protege, whatever you want to call them, gets to understand for themselves what are their assumptions about their limitations of power. What are their assumptions about their relationship with the world? And it sounds fluffy, but it isn't. It's because if I know what my attitude is towards my world, then I have an idea of what I can do with or for the world. So they need to become not just self-aware. There's no such thing as self-aware. They're self-aware in the world, aware of how they position themselves. So that's number one. They need to get to know themselves, number one. And the leader can help them do that. And then the leader is able to say, somebody with power, say, well, what are you going to use this power for? What do you want to do? How are you going to do it? What is the best way to exercise that? So one is getting to know themselves, and the second one is understanding the context, the purpose for which that power is going to be used. And by the way, they also need to understand that power and exercise of power in one organization or one is not going to be the same in the next one. I made a fatal mistake of assuming, because I came out of the media business, which was very hierarchical in those days, when I moved to another kind of company, and I thought I was being very nice. I thought I was being quite normal because, if you were an editor or a managing editor in a media organization and you said, jump, they jumped. Not because they knew the time factor was short. You say that to a technology organization and you say jump, they go, why? Why should I jump? Give me one good reason. So context is really important. Leader needs to be able to therefore make sure that the person becomes self-aware in the world, number one. Also, how they're going to, the methods of using power, the methods of bringing people in, understanding and helping them to remove the myths of leading from the front. You lead from the middle, and understanding the value of partnerships, and finally understanding that different context, different exercise of power, different ways of using power, different ways of communicating.
My last question on power is, should people seek it? Because to be honest, there's a lot of people that will be in organizations and you're like, I'm fine. I'm good. I like my silo. I like where I work. I don't want to have anybody reporting to me. I'm perfectly happy where I am. So their relationship to power is an other. It is what other people do, not what they do. Should they still explore power?
If those people want to expand their scope to do, in other words, I'm just thinking of my own example earlier on when I was a very young man. When I was doing that stuff in radio, making plays, writing and directing plays and things like that, did I want to become the head of drama? No, didn't. So that was fine. Now, the way I will seek power, however, if I wanted to control or to... Okay, let me give you another example. One of the people who I greatly admire is a great educator who came out of Jamaica and was an immigrant into Britain, and he basically wanted to make sure that the way education was being taught to immigrant and refugee children was changed because it was just not working. So after, 4 years or something as a teacher, he decided, no, not good enough. So he applied to become a deputy head teacher. And he applied 49 times, Russell, 49 times. And finally got one because he was black and he was in at that stage, very racist Britain. And he got it. And I said, why did you do that? He said, because I needed to be further up the food chain to influence the decision makers. So why did he choose power? In order to do more, to be more creative. And I think if you don't want to do that, if you're seeking power for power over, don't do it. If you're seeking power for power over, don't do it. If you're seeking power so that you can be more creative, do more things, be further up the food chain so that there is more scope for your innovation, etc., innovativeness, etc., that's when you do it. Don't seek power for power's sake. It doesn't work. Don't seek money for money's sake. It doesn't work either.
So, Stephen, I have to finish the show. Thank you so much with the last question, which is, what's one simple action people can do right now to improve their relationships at work?
Don't compete with your colleagues. It's a complete waste of time.
Short and sweet. That is Dr. Stephen Barden. He is a board advisor, strategic advisor, and leadership coach mentor. He's also the author of How Successful Leaders Do Business with Their World, The Navigational Stance. Thanks so much for your time, Stephen.
Thank you, Russell. That was great fun. Thank you very much. Cheers.
And that will do it for another episode of Relationships at Work, the leader's guide to creating a workplace we love. I'm Russell. Always a pleasure hanging out with you. If you have a moment of time and you've enjoyed what you've heard, please go over to Apple or Spotify and give a like and review and show a little bit of love and support. It really, really means a lot, and it really helps the show get seen and followed. Thank you.